The fog clings to the shoreline like a shroud, and you are just a villager, barefoot on wet earth, listening. At first it is only a faint thrum, like thunder rolling across the sea. Then it grows, drums, heavy and unrelenting, echoing through the mist. You smell it before you see it, the acrid smoke of burning pitch, the sour stench of sweat carried by the wind. A scream splits the air, followed by the iron song of blades clashing. You stumble toward the cliff edge and glimpse the horror below, long ships slicing through the surf, dragonheads snarling at the shore. The waves themselves seem to carry fire, reflected from torches already set upon your neighbors' homes. This is no raid. You realize, with a chill colder than the sea spray on your skin, that it is annihilation. A force of 800 has descended, and somehow, impossibly, they will tear through armies 40 times their size. How could this be? If this glimpse into forgotten shadows grips you, hit subscribe and share in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It fuels more unearthings like this one. For centuries, Vikings were not just raiders, but a living nightmare across Europe. From the late 700s to the 11th century, their dragon-proud ships appeared on coasts like omens of death. Kingdoms restructured their defenses, monasteries fortified their walls, and entire economies bent under the pressure of tribute payments simply to be spared. Their reputation was so vast that whispers of their coming could scatter armies before a single axe was raised. Frankish annals, Arab geographers, and Irish monks all recorded the same conclusion. These horrors were not accidents of war, but deliberate, institutionalized campaigns. What we uncover next are the mechanics of fear itself, how terror became a weapon sharper than steel. The massacre did not begin with swords. It began with silence. When the longships pulled onto foreign shores, they carried not only warriors but a system, a machine of terror carefully engineered to break societies long before blades met flesh. Imagine the first moments after conquest, the cries of the captured, the smoke curling above shattered villages, and the survivors herded into public squares. Here, the Vikings revealed their true genius, not merely in killing, but in sorting, in calculating, in reducing human life into categories and ledgers. Contemporary chroniclers speak of this ritual with a shuddering fascination. Men of fighting age were separated first, their value measured not in strength but in threat. A capable warrior was often executed on the spot, his death staged as a warning to others. Women and children, however, were handled differently. They were processed like inventory, divided by age, beauty, or potential usefulness. 15 females, aged 16 to 20, excellent condition, one Irish record describes, listed beside cattle and barrels of wine. Mothers were forced to watch as their daughters were taken, sons pried from their arms, husbands cut down to ensure compliance. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was futile, family bonds meaningless. This was systematic. Again and again across the British Isles, Francia, Iberia, and even into the heart of Eastern Europe, the same pattern unfolded. The Vikings turned conquest into choreography, first shock, then separation, then a bureaucratic erasure of identity. A thrall, what the Norse called their slaves, was not given a name. They were assigned roles: cook, concubine, rower. Language itself became a weapon, severing a person's past with a single label. The scale was staggering. Archaeological digs at Dublin, once the largest slave market in the north, reveal holding pens that could contain hundreds, if not thousands, of captives at a time. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of men, women, and children passed through each year, their lives measured in silver dirhams imported from the Islamic world. Slave raids were not chaotic side ventures. They were the backbone of an economy. Markets fluctuated with supply. A glut of young captives after a raid in Ireland could depress prices in Hedeby or Birka. For Viking leaders, this was wealth management, and terror was the most reliable currency. Transportation was itself a horror. Captives were bound in chains, forced into the hulls of ships with little air, less food, and almost no water. Mortality rates of 15 to 20% were considered acceptable losses. When a captive died en route, the body was tossed overboard without ceremony, recorded in ledgers alongside spoiled grain or broken amphorae. Survivors emerged weeks later, half mad from thirst and darkness, only to face the next indignity: public sale. The process of identity erasure deepened there. Chroniclers in Al-Andalus note captives paraded through markets stripped of clothing, mocked for their faith, their rituals deliberately inverted. Christian monks were forced to drink from horns dedicated to Odin, Muslim captives sometimes circumcised against their will to sever ties with their communities. These rituals were not random cruelty, they were psychological warfare. By breaking the spirit of the enslaved in front of a jeering crowd, the Vikings made an example of them, spreading dread far beyond the marketplace. This dread metastasized into legend. By the 9th century, tales spread across Europe that Viking armor could not be pierced by arrows, that their fury was fueled by sorcery, that they fought alongside demons or angels. The truth was more chilling. Their greatest weapon was fear. Armies of thousands often collapsed at the rumor of Viking fleets approaching, villages evacuated before ships even landed, leaving stores of food, silver, and captives for the taking. It was not brute strength but psychology, an industrial-scale manipulation of terror that allowed 800 warriors to paralyze populations of 40,000. Families responded in desperate ways. Chronicles from the Rhineland tell of parents mutilating their children, breaking limbs, scarring faces to render them less desirable to slavers. Oral traditions from Ireland recount mothers drowning infants rather than see them taken. These stories were whispered across generations, embedding terror into the cultural DNA of entire regions. Resistance was not merely difficult, it seemed impossible. The system thrived on the despair it created. Yet behind the despair lay cold arithmetic. Viking commanders received bonuses not only for treasure, but for captives delivered alive. Slaves were a form of portable wealth, far more lucrative than gold. Contemporary Arabic sources describe silver dirhams stamped in Samarkand and Baghdad found in Viking hoards, proof of a vast trade stretching from the North Sea to the Caspian. Human beings were the link. They were sold into Andalusian courts, Abbasid harems, Byzantine households. A girl captured in Ireland could, within a year, find herself in Cordoba or Constantinople, her name forgotten, her lineage erased. Pause and consider that scale. One raid in 845 on Paris brought back hundreds, if not thousands, of captives. Multiply that by decades of systematic raiding, and you begin to see how 800 Vikings could hold entire kingdoms hostage, not by sheer force, but by engineering an empire of fear and commerce in human lives. And this was only the beginning. The terror deepened not just through raids, but through the journey that followed. To the Vikings, captives were cargo, and like cargo, they were treated with ruthless pragmatism. Bound together in chains, shoved into the dark bellies of longships, they endured voyages where the line between life and death blurred. Chroniclers in Francia recorded entire rows of children lashed to benches, forced to row when exhaustion claimed older slaves. The smell of human waste and rot was so overwhelming that even seasoned raiders covered their mouths with cloth. Yet, in the eyes of their captors, this was not cruelty. It was logistics. Mortality rates of 1 in 6 were factored in as acceptable, the same way a merchant might expect some spoilage of grain or wine. When survivors finally stumbled onto foreign soil, they faced public humiliation as ritual. Markets in Dublin, Hedeby, and York were not quiet exchanges, but spectacles. Archaeological excavations reveal elevated platforms designed for display, echoing descriptions from monastic annals. Captives paraded before crowds, stripped of identity, prodded and examined like livestock. They inspected their teeth as if they were horses, wrote one horrified monk. The process was euphemistic, called sorting or valuation, but its reality was degradation. A young woman's price was set not by her name or story, but by the symmetry of her face, the curve of her body, or the perceived resilience of her womb. This industrial-scale dehumanization was systematic. Each transaction fed into a vast network stretching across continents. Slaves captured in the British Isles appeared in Byzantine records. Bones found in Sweden carry isotopes proving origins in Eastern Europe. Every raid, every sale, was part of a pipeline. The Viking economy relied on it. Leaders used human cargo to secure alliances, pay mercenaries, and purchase luxuries from far-flung markets. Silver coins from Baghdad piled in Scandinavian hoards are mute witnesses to the trade, the silent graves of those who were exchanged for them. Psychological warfare amplified this system. Raids were timed to harvest not only wealth but terror. Chronicles describe Viking fleets arriving at dawn on feast days, when churches were full, when villagers least expected attack. The symbolism was deliberate. To sack a monastery on Easter, to enslave priests during a holy mass, was to send a message: even your gods cannot protect you. This message traveled faster than ships. By the 10th century, entire coastal regions offered tribute. Danegeld, not because they had been attacked, but because they feared what might come if they resisted. It was terror institutionalized, extortion transformed into policy. And yet, the cruelty did not end with sale. For captives who survived the market, the next phase was assimilation, or obliteration. Many were forced to take Norse names, baptized into pagan rituals meant to sever them from their pasts. Conversion was not an act of faith, but of domination. Slaves might be compelled to desecrate their own holy symbols, trample crosses, or mock their own prayers. Chroniclers in Ireland and Francia alike describe these rituals as worse than death, for they killed not the body, but the soul. Family bonds were the first casualties. Parents and children were almost always separated, deliberately so. Viking law codes, preserved on rune stones and in sagas, made it clear the value of a slave was greater when stripped of ties. A child sold alone was easier to control, a mother without kin more pliable. Resistance meant punishment. Accounts describe slaves branded with hot irons, their foreheads scarred with runes marking them as property. Some bore iron collars engraved with chilling inscriptions: "Hold me lest I flee." These devices, unearthed in archaeological digs, stand as stark proof of a world where human beings were catalogued as animals. Even resistance itself was weaponized. In some cases, captured warriors were forced to fight in Viking armies, their survival dependent on betraying their own. The psychological toll was immense. Made executioners of their kin, women turned into instruments of alliance through forced marriage. The system recycled its victims, feeding them back into the very machinery that had destroyed their lives. This was terror perfected, self-perpetuating, systemic, and devastatingly efficient. Consider the ripple effects. Communities devastated by raids often reshaped their entire cultures around the fear of enslavement. Parents in the Balkans tattooed their children's faces with disfiguring marks to deter raiders. Villages in Ireland developed elaborate watch systems, lighting fires on coastal hills at the first sign of sails. Oral traditions carried the dread forward, ensuring that even generations who had never seen a Viking ship lived in fear of its shadow. Terror outlasted conquest. It became inherited memory. The statistics alone stagger the imagination. Some scholars estimate that during the peak of the Viking Age, as many as 50,000 people a year were trafficked through Scandinavian markets. Multiply that by centuries, and the number reaches into the millions. These were not nameless figures. They were mothers, fathers, children, each reduced to an entry in a ledger. 10 captives, fair of hair, strong of limb, reads one fragmentary record. Behind every euphemism lies a story erased. The irony is that the very efficiency of this system created myths of invincibility. Chronicles describe Viking war bands of mere hundreds facing armies of tens of thousands and emerging victorious. How? Not simply because of superior tactics or ships, but because of the psychological collapse of their enemies. Fear hollowed out resistance. Soldiers deserted before battle, peasants fled villages, rulers chose to pay tribute rather than risk slaughter. The massacre of 40,000 by 800 was not a miracle of arms. It was the inevitable outcome of terror institutionalized, and so the nightmare spread. From the North Sea to the Caspian, from Dublin to Constantinople, the same story repeated, small bands wielding fear as a weapon more devastating than fire or steel. Their legacy was not just plunder but the normalization of cruelty, the turning of human lives into commodities, the entrenchment of slavery as the foundation of power. This was the true horror of the Viking Age. Not only the axes and the fire, but the system behind them, the machine that turned terror into policy, brutality into commerce, and millions of lives into profit. The deeper one peers into the Viking Age, the more it resembles a machine, not a series of random raids. Every raid, every slaughter, every auction was a cog in a system that perpetuated itself, refining terror into something resembling industry. And like any machine, it demanded fuel human lives. The most chilling aspect of this system was its ability to recycle victims. Captives, once stripped of their identities, were often pressed into the very apparatus that had destroyed them. Strong men, spared from execution, were forced to row Viking ships. Shackled to the benches, they propelled their captors toward new victims. Women, abducted from their homes, were sometimes compelled into roles as scouts, translators, or guides, their survival tethered to betraying the lands they once called home. In sagas preserved on vellum centuries later, we find traces of these coerced roles, slaves who served the prow or walked before the host, walking contradictions, victims weaponized as tools of conquest. Chroniclers also speak of what might be called breeding programs, though cloaked in euphemism. Captive women, selected for youth and health, were distributed among raiders not simply as concubines, but as investments. Their children, born into Norse households, became part of the system, raised as Scandinavians, their original identities erased. Some sagas even boast of noble families tracing lineages to women taken in the West, or brought from the East. Here, terror was not only about the moment of capture, but about generational absorption, bloodlines themselves weaponized to expand the reach of empire. To yield 100 survivors who could serve or breed, 1,000 might be slain. Ratios like this appear in records disguised as cold calculations of efficiency. The brutality was framed as mathematics, 1 life preserved for every 10 destroyed. What to us seems monstrous was, to them, rational. And herein lay the genius of systemic cruelty. It hid its horrors beneath ledgers and numbers, making the unthinkable seem orderly, inevitable. Spectacle was another cog in this machinery. Raids did not always end in quiet markets. They sometimes concluded with staged humiliations designed to awe local populations. In York and Dublin, records describe captives whipped through streets, their suffering transformed into public entertainment. Punishments were not limited to slaves, they extended to defiant villages. Entire populations might be forced to watch as leaders were executed in ritualized fashion, hanged from sacred trees, burned alive, or drowned in rivers, their deaths turned into theater. The crowd was both audience and participant, complicit in the reinforcement of fear. These spectacles had layers of meaning. To the Vikings, they were a way of asserting divine mandate, proof that Odin and Thor favored them. To the victims, they were a psychological wrecking ball, shattering any notion of resistance. Fear was cumulative. By the time raiders reached a new coast, rumors of past atrocities had already softened defenses. The massacre of 40,000 by 800 was not won in the moment of combat, but in years of accumulated dread, and it was not merely about soldiers. Legal codes preserved in Icelandic texts show how the system codified cruelty. Rape was euphemistically framed as property damage. If a slave woman was violated by another man, compensation was owed not to her, but to her owner, reducing her suffering to an entry in a ledger. Justice itself became a tool of dehumanization. In such a framework, every act of violence reinforced the machinery of control. Pause and consider: when societies enshrine exploitation into law, when cruelty becomes entertainment, when generations are born into roles as both victim and tool, resistance itself seems unthinkable. This was the true edge the Vikings carried, sharper than any blade. The horror of the Viking machine reached its full momentum not in isolated raids, but in cycles, predictable, seasonal rhythms of exploitation. Scouts mapped coastlines months in advance, noting which villages had harvests ripening, which monasteries housed treasure, which towns lacked garrisons. When spring thaws freed the rivers and seas, fleets launched like clockwork. Terror itself was scheduled, arriving with the same inevitability as the seasons. By the 10th century, the anticipation of raids was often more devastating than the raids themselves. Communities surrendered without a fight, offering food, gold, and even their own people as tribute. This was the logic of Danegeld. the infamous payment that kingdoms across Europe made to stave off destruction. Rulers rationalized it as diplomacy, but in truth, it was institutionalized extortion. To refuse meant annihilation. To comply meant feeding the machine. Each payment encouraged larger fleets. Each act of submission emboldened new campaigns. Legal codes reflected this normalization. Viking leaders issued rules on how to divide spoils: 1 share for each warrior, 2 shares for the ship's captain, additional shares for those who secured the most captives. This turned raiding into a competition, incentivizing cruelty. Captives were no longer incidental. They were the most prized commodity, a measure of prestige. In one saga, a chieftain boasts not of silver, but of the hundreds led behind me in chains. Such statements were both threat and advertisement, luring ambitious men into the business of terror. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was how quickly these horrors became invisible to those who benefited from them. In Norse sagas, thralls are mentioned as casually as livestock, woven into the fabric of households without acknowledgement of their suffering. Children grew up in homes where slaves cooked, cleaned, and bore children without ever being recognized as human equals. The abnormal became normal, brutality became background noise. Generations were raised to see exploitation as the natural order. And yet, the victim's despair found its own ways of haunting the future. In Christian chronicles, Viking raids are described as divine punishment, scourges sent by God to humble the faithful. In Arabic sources, the Norse were remembered as the Majwas, fire worshippers, their cruelty noted with a mix of fear and disgust. Oral traditions across Ireland and the Slavic lands kept alive memories of villages erased, daughters stolen, sons vanished forever. These stories outlasted the raids themselves, embedding trauma into the cultural memory of entire regions. This cultural terror explains how 800 could massacre 40,000. It was not merely a matter of superior weapons or tactics. It was paralysis born of expectation, armies undone before battle by the certainty of what awaited if they lost. Entire villages would rather burn their own fields than see them feed raiders. Parents would rather disfigure their children than see them sold. The Vikings did not need to fight every enemy. They needed only to ensure the stories of their cruelty traveled farther than their sails. And so, the machine sustained itself. Tribute funded fleets, fleets captured slaves, slaves fueled economies, economies paid tribute. Fear became currency, cruelty became law, and generations grew up inside a cycle where exploitation was not only profitable, but inevitable. This is the true climax of the Viking Age, not a single battle, but a system so efficient, so terrifying, that it rewired the societies it touched. Entire populations lived under the shadow of annihilation, while the raiders themselves thrived on the profits of despair. The machine did not need to last forever. Its scars did. Step back from the smoke and the screams, and the scale of it becomes almost unbearable. How could 800 men rout 40,000? Not by strength alone, not by swords sharper or shields stronger, but by wielding terror as a weapon more devastating than steel. The massacre was not a fluke. It was the logical consequence of a system that turned fear into machinery, cruelty into policy, and human beings into currency. Civilization is fragile. What the Viking Age reveals is how quickly societies can normalize the unthinkable. When tribute payments became law, when markets hummed with the trade of stolen lives, when children grew up watching slaves labor in silence, the boundaries of morality shifted. Terror became tradition. Exploitation became economics. And for those caught in the middle, the daughters, the sons, the parents torn apart, the scars outlasted the empires themselves. Archaeology still whispers their stories. Iron collars inscribed with, "Hold me lest I flee." Shackles unearthed from riverbeds. Mass graves where bones bear marks of violence, starvation, and despair. Chronicles preserve the rest. Irish monks scribbling of abbeys burning. Frankish annals tallying Danegeld extorted in silver. Arab travelers describing northern raiders with a mixture of awe and disgust. These are not just relics. They are receipts, ledgers of misery carefully recorded and unwilling to vanish. And yet, in remembering, we resist erasure. To speak of those lost is to deny the silence their captors sought to impose. To acknowledge their suffering is to wrest dignity from the hands of history. The lesson endures. Unchecked power can turn intimacy into a weapon, can turn families into commodities, can turn entire civilizations into shadows trembling at the knock of oars against a hull. But remembrance is also armor. To know what was done is to see how fragile justice remains. The whispers of the Viking Age echo into our own. Economies still built on exploitation, propaganda still wielding fear as power, the abnormal still normalized in the name of profit. The past is not gone. It lingers, like scars beneath the skin of culture, reminders of how easily the human heart can be broken, and how fiercely it must be defended. If this history stirred you, let it not end in silence. Subscribe, share this story, and tell me in the comments where it hit hardest for you. Together, we will confront the next buried truth and remember those the world once tried to forget.